The high desert air is thin and cold, sharp enough to steal the breath from your lungs. It carries the scent of dust, creosote, and the deep, abiding loneliness of the plains. For the young Apache girl, it carries something else tonight, the warm, living scent of salvation. Her hands, chapped and trembling, rest on the flank of a Jersey cow, feeling the heat of it through the coarse hide. The cow shifts its weight, lowing softly, its bell a dull, muffled clank in the profound stillness. The girl's own belly is a tight drum beneath her worn dress, a constant, aching reminder of the life within her and the life she cannot provide. Milk, that's all she wants, not for herself, but for the hope she carries. The hunger that gnaws at her is an old friend, but the fear for her unborn child is a new and terrible master. This is Jedediah Crannell's land, and stealing from him is a death sentence. But starvation is a slower, more certain one. And so, she stands here, under a sliver of moon in the vast, indifferent dark, committing a crime for the most innocent of reasons. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. She has no rope, only her desperation. She coaxes the animal forward, her voice a soft, guttural whisper that is more a prayer than a command. The cow, placid and perhaps sensing no threat from this small, fragile human, follows without protest. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounds like a gunshot in the silence. Every hoot of a distant owl seems to mock her audacity. She knows this is a fool's errand, a desperate gamble against impossible odds. The town, Clearwater Gulch, festers just over the rise, a collection of souls as hard and unforgiving as the land they inhabit. They would not see a starving mother. They would only see a thief, an Indian, a trespasser on their rigid, brutal code of ownership. A guttural cry ripped through the silence, not from an owl, but from a man. Thief! By God, that's my jersey! Thief! The words were a hammer blow, shattering the fragile hope she had harbored. Her life, and the one she carried, were now measured in the seconds it would take for him to reach her. The dust of Clearwater Gulch was a fine, red powder that settled on everything, a constant, gritty reminder of the parched land for which the town scraped its existence. It settled on the brim of Sheriff Silas Thorne's hat, in the creases of his weary face, and in the silence of his office. He was a man built of the same lean, durable material as the landscape, his features carved by sun and solitude. At 40, he possessed the quiet gravity of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little, his authority resting not on bluster, but on a stillness that few men dared to test. His office was his sanctuary and his cage. A scarred oak desk held a neat stack of paperwork, a cold coffee cup, and his Colt peacemaker, which he was meticulously cleaning with an oiled rag. The familiar weight of the weapon, the scent of the oil, the rhythmic, circular motions of his hand. These were the rituals that held the chaos at bay. The single barred window looked out onto the main street, a desolate artery of commerce and suspicion. He saw Mrs. Gable sweep her porch with a furious energy, as if she could brush away the town's inherent griminess. He saw two miners stumble out of the saloon, their laughter harsh and hollow. He saw the ever-present judgment in the eyes of the townsfolk, a constant, low-grade fever of prejudice that flared at the slightest provocation. Silas had taken the badge 5 years ago, believing the law could be a shield. He'd since learned it was more often a hammer, and the people of Clearwater Gulch were always looking for a nail. They were good people, he supposed, in the way that cornered animals were good at surviving. They were hardened by drought, by failed claims, by the endless, grinding work of staying alive. But that hardness had calcified their hearts, especially towards the Apache, the Ute, the Navajo, the people who had been there first and were now treated as ghosts or vermin, inconvenient reminders of a stolen birthright. Silas didn't harbor grand illusions about changing their minds, but he clung to one simple, unyielding principle. The law applied to everyone, or it meant nothing at all. It was a lonely creed in a town that preferred its justice swift, simple, and serve at the end of a rope. Miles away, in a shallow, rocky arroyo, the girl huddled against the stolen cow. Her name was Nita, a name that meant bear in her tongue, but she felt as small and fragile as a field mouse. Fear was a cold stone in her gut, heavier than the baby. The man's shout had sent her scrambling, dragging the cow into the first defensible position she could find. She had lost her people months ago, not to soldiers, but to sickness, a coughing plague that had stolen the breath from her mother, her father, and the young man who had put this child in her belly. Cast out by the few survivors, who saw her pregnancy as a bad omen, a mouth they couldn't feed, she had wandered south, following the ghost of a river, surviving on roots and the charity of lizards. The cow was a miracle. She had stumbled upon Crandall's small herd, seeing the full udder of the Jersey, and a primal, maternal desperation had overwhelmed all reason. Now, clutching the warm, solid bulk of the animal, she listened. The night was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of approaching hoofbeats, the angry, excited shouts of men. They were hunting her. She pressed her face into the cow's flank, a sob catching in her throat, dry and soundless. She had stolen not for greed, but for life. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the men coming for her would not see the difference. To them, a theft was a theft, and an Indian was an Indian. The two together were an excuse for a kind of cruelty they would call justice. The door to the sheriff's office flew open with a bang that rattled the glass in the window frame. Jedediah Crandall stood there, his face florid with rage, his portly frame heaving. He was a man whose prosperity had made him arrogant, not generous. Behind him stood two of his ranch hands, their expressions a mixture of excitement and malice. "Sheriff," Crandall bellowed, his voice filling the small room. "I've been robbed. An Indian squaw stole my prized jersey, right out of my pasture." Silas finished wiping down the cylinder of his Colt before slowly reassembling it. He didn't look up. "Evening, Jedediah. You're sure it was an Indian?" "Saw her plain as day. A slip of a thing, but quick. My man saw her dragging the beast off towards the canyons. We're going after her." Crandall's hand rested on the butt of the pistol holstered at his thick waist. "Thought I'd give you the courtesy of knowing we're forming a posse. We'll have my cow back and that thief strung up by sunup." Silas slid the cylinder back into the frame of the revolver. The click was sharp and final in the tense silence. He finally lifted his eyes, and their calm intensity seemed to drain some of the bluster from the room. "No, you won't." Crandall bristled. "What do you mean, no, I won't?" "She stole my property, and the law will handle it," Silas said, his voice level. "There will be no posse. There will be no lynching in my jurisdiction. Not tonight, not ever. Now, you can ride out with me and point me to where you last saw her, or you can go home. But you and your men will not be dispensing any justice. Is that clear?" The ranch hands shuffled their feet, suddenly less confident without the fuel of Crandall's rage. Crandall himself looked ready to explode, his face a mottled purple. He saw the unyielding resolve in the sheriff's eyes, the quiet promise of trouble if he pushed. He had seen that look before, and he knew it wasn't a bluff. "Fine," he spat, the word dripping with resentment. "But if she gets away, it's on your head, Thorne. And if my cow comes to any harm, so will she." Silas stood, buckling on his gun belt. "The only harm that's going to come to anyone is if you get in my way." He grabbed his hat from the peg. "Let's ride." He stepped out into the cold night air, Crandall and his men falling in behind him. The town was awake now, lights flickering on in windows, doors creaking open. The news was spreading like wildfire, carried on whispers of Indian and thief. Silas could feel the eyes on his back, a weight of expectation. They wanted blood. They wanted a simple story with a simple, violent ending. As he swung up onto his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust Devil, he felt a familiar weariness settle over him. He was riding out not just to find a thief, but to stand against the ugliest parts of the very people he was sworn to protect. The tracks were easy to follow in the moonlight. A cow's clumsy prints, and beside them, the small, moccasin footprints of a single person. Silas dismounted, examining the trail while Crandall and his men watched impatiently from their saddles. "See? Just like I said," Crandall grumbled. "Headed for the rocks. We should just rush in there, flush her out." Silas ignored him. He knelt, tracing the edge of one of the smaller prints with his finger. The stride was short, uneven. The person was tired, maybe hurt. They weren't moving fast. This wasn't a professional rustler. It was someone desperate. He looked at the cow's tracks. They were placid, unhurried. The animal hadn't been forced or beaten. It had been led. Coaxed. "She's on foot, and she's not moving with any speed," Silas said, standing up and dusting off his hands. "We'll find her." He remounted and urged Dust Devil forward, keeping his eyes on the ground. There was a story in these tracks, and it wasn't the one Crandall was telling. This wasn't a story of malicious theft. It was a story of flight, of desperation. The trail led them away from the open plains and into a labyrinth of sandstone and shadow, the terrain growing more difficult. "She's trying to lose us in here," one of the hands muttered. "She's trying to hide," Silas corrected quietly. He could feel the tension radiating from the men behind him. Their patience was wearing thin. They wanted a chase, a confrontation. This slow, methodical tracking was aggravating their thirst for action. Silas knew he had to find her first. He had to be the one to control the encounter. If Crandall and his men got to her before he did, the law wouldn't get a say in what happened next. He rounded a tall spire of rock and pulled Dust Devil to a halt. There, in a small, sheltered alcove barely big enough to conceal them, stood the Jersey cow. And huddled beside it, her face pale in the moonlight, was the girl. She was younger than he'd expected, little more than a child herself, her dark eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to eclipse everything else. And then he saw it, the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the thin fabric of her dress. She was pregnant. The sight hit him like a physical blow. All the pieces clicked into place. The slow, faltering tracks. The gentle handling of the cow. The desperation. It wasn't about the value of the animal. It was about the milk. Before he could say a word, Crandall and his men rounded the rock behind him. "There she is," Crandall roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "The thieving witch. Get her!" His men spurred their horses forward, hands dropping to their guns. Nita shrank back against the cow, a small, trapped animal, her eyes darting between the angry men and the silent sheriff. In that moment, Silas Thorne's world simplified. The law, his duty, his weariness, it all fell away. There was only the girl, the child she carried, and the feral injustice of the men bearing down on them. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply moved Dust Devil, positioning his horse broadside, creating a living barrier between the girl and the posse. "Hold," he commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the clamor with the sharp edge of absolute authority. Crandall's horse skittered to a halt just feet from him. "Get out of the way, Thorne. She's mine to deal with." "She's in my custody now, Jedediah," Silas said, his eyes locked on Crandall's. He didn't look at the girl, but he was acutely aware of her shallow, panicked breaths, of the silent plea in her terror. "This is over." "The hell it is," Crandall spat, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You're protecting her? An Indian thief over a white man? Whose side are you on?" Silas looked from Crandall's enraged face to the girl's terrified one. He saw her hand resting protectively on her swollen abdomen. He saw a future mother, not a criminal. A survivor, not a savage. "I'm on the side of the law," he said, but the words felt hollow. His decision went deeper than that. It was a choice of conscience, and the law says she gets a hearing, not a rope. He had drawn a line in the sand, and the entire hateful weight of Clearwater Gulch was on the other side. The cold desert wind whipped around them, carrying the seeds of a confrontation that would define him and decide the fate of the terrified girl hiding in his shadow. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken threats. Crandall's men shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting between their boss and the unmoving sheriff. They were hired guns and ranch hands, not men accustomed to defying a badge, but Crandall's fury was a potent force. "Your custody?" Crandall sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. She's not a citizen, Thorn. She's chattel. Less than that. She's a pest. You don't give a pest a hearing, you exterminate it. Silas kept his horse steady, a bulwark of calm against the tide of hatred. He knew that any sign of weakness, any hint of hesitation, would be seen as an opening. He needed to de-escalate the situation, to get the girl away from these men. He slowly dismounted, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He kept his body between Nita and the others. He turned his head slightly, trying to catch her eye. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and steady. He didn't know if she understood the words, but he hoped she understood the tone. She pressed herself harder against the cow, her knuckles white where she gripped the animal's hide. Her eyes were black pools of fear, but within them, a flicker of defiance burned. She would not be taken easily. Silas unhooked his canteen from his saddle horn. He uncorked it and took a short drink himself, then held it out towards her. It was a simple gesture, an offering of water in a dry land, a universal sign of peace. For a long moment, she just stared at it, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He could see the conflict in her face, the instinct to recoil from the enemy, pitted against a desperate, burning thirst. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand and took the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and the contact was like a spark of electricity, a fleeting connection of shared humanity in a landscape of hate. She drank, her throat working convulsively. When she was done, she held it out to him, her eyes never leaving his face. He took it and corked it, giving her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a tiny truce, a fragile bridge built between two worlds. "See that?" Crandall snarled, misinterpreting the moment entirely. "She's trying to beguile you. Don't be a fool, Sheriff. We're wasting time." He began to edge his horse around Silas's buckskin. "That's far enough, Jedediah," Silas warned, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. He didn't move, didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, a man made of granite and resolve. The impasse stretched thin and taut. The fate of the girl, the integrity of his badge, the very soul of the town, it all hung in this cold, starlit balance. Silas knew he couldn't stay here. He had to get her back to town, to the relative safety of his jail. It was a grim sanctuary, but it was the only one he could offer. "She's coming with me," Silas announced, his voice ringing with finality. He turned to Nita, using a gesture to indicate she should walk. "You, cool me." Nita hesitated, her eyes darting to the angry faces of Crandall's men. She looked back at Silas, at his calm, steady expression. He was a white man, an enforcer of their law, an enemy by every definition she had ever known. But he had given her water. He had placed his body between her and the others. It was a choice between the certain threat of the mob and the unknown intentions of this quiet, solitary man. She took a tentative step forward. Silas gestured to the cow, and the animal comes too. "It's evidence." Crandall let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Evidence? You're arresting my cow." "I'm securing the scene," Silas replied flatly. He took Dust Devil's reins in one hand. With the other, he gestured again for Nita to walk ahead of him. She took the cow's lead, her movements still wary, but compliant. She understood. He was her only way out of this canyon alive. As they began the slow procession out of the arroyo, Crandall and his men fell in behind them, a thunderous, resentful escort. The ride back to Clearwater Gulch was a slow-motion countdown to a detonation. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Every hoofbeat on the rocky ground was a tick of the clock. Silas was acutely aware of the girl walking just ahead of him. He saw the proud, straight line of her back, the way she refused to stumble or show fear, even with her hunters trailing her. There was a strength in her that went beyond mere survival. It was a core of resilience, an unbending spirit that the harshness of the world had not yet managed to break. He found himself admiring it, and the feeling was both unexpected and unsettling. His job was to be impartial, a vessel for the law, but impartiality was impossible now. He had chosen a side. The first scattered lights of Clearwater Gulch appeared over the rise, and Silas felt his gut tighten. The canyon had been a private confrontation. The town would be a public spectacle. The whispers he'd felt on his way out would be a roar by the time he returned. Creddle would see to that. He was bringing the conflict to the heart of Silas's authority, forcing a showdown in front of everyone. As they entered the main street, it was just as he'd feared. People were spilling out of the saloon, the hotel, the mercantile. Lamps were held aloft, casting a flickering, hellish glow on a sea of curious and hostile faces. The low murmur of the crowd was an ugly, dangerous sound. "He's got her," someone shouted. "And the cow," another voice added, with a note of dark humor. Crandall spurred his horse forward, riding alongside Silas, his voice pitched to carry to the assembled crowd. "Sheriff Thorne here thinks this thief deserves a trial. He's protecting her, an Apache who steals from us, eats our food, and he puts his badge between her and honest folk." The crowd surged, their mood shifting from curiosity to anger. Voices rose, ugly words cutting through the night. "Savage thief, string her up." Nita flinched at the wall of sound and hate, her steps faltering. She instinctively moved closer to the comforting bulk of Silas's horse. Silas saw the motion, the brief crack in her stoic facade. He saw the terror she was trying so desperately to hide. This was it, the moment of truth. He couldn't protect her by hiding her. He had to do it out in the open, under the glare of their judgment. His plan had been to secure her in the jail cell, a temporary fix. But he saw now that wouldn't be enough. The mob was too inflamed. A locked door wouldn't hold them back if they truly wanted in. He had to break their fever now, on this street. He reined in Dust Devil directly in front of his office. The crowd pressed in, a tight, suffocating circle of bodies and rage. Crandall dismounted, swaggering, sensing his victory. He was the town's righteous anger made flesh. Silas was the lone obstacle. "Give her to us, Sheriff," Crandall said, his voice low and confident. He took a step towards Nita, his hand outstretched as if to grab her. "We'll handle this ourselves. We know how to deal with her kind." His men moved with him, their faces grim, their intent clear. They were going to take her. It happened in a heartbeat. Nita let out a small, choked gasp and shrank back, pressing herself against Dust Devil's leg. The horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension. In that instant, something broke in Silas Thorne. It was the last thread of his professional detachment, the weary cynicism that had protected him for so long. All that was left was a cold, pure resolve. He swung down from his saddle, landing on the balls of his feet with a grace that belied his size. He moved so quickly he seemed to materialize between Crandall and the girl. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his presence a silent, absolute command. "That's far enough, Jedediah," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried over the grumbling of the crowd. Crandall, drunk on his own power and the support of the mob, was not to be deterred. He saw a lone man standing against the tide. He sneered. "She ain't worth the lead to hang her, but my cow is." He lunged, his hand reaching for Nita's arm. Silas didn't move back. He didn't hesitate. His hand blurred, a motion of impossible speed. The Colt Peacemaker was in his fist, its dark metal seeming to absorb the lamplight. But he didn't aim it at Crandall. He didn't aim it at the crowd. He pointed the barrel straight up at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a crack of thunder that ripped through the night and stunned the street into absolute silence. The single shot was a punctuation mark, a full stop to the rising hysteria. Horses shied, men flinched back, and a collective gasp went through the crowd as the ringing in their ears subsided. The smell of burnt gunpowder, sharp and clean, cut through the stench of whiskey and sweat. In the ringing silence, every eye was fixed on the sheriff. He stood motionless, the smoking pistol still pointing at the heavens, a silent testament to the line that had just been drawn. The sky had been his witness and his warning shot. Slowly, he lowered the gun, though he did not holster it. He let it hang at his side, a heavy, potent symbol of his authority. His gaze swept over the crowd, meeting the eyes of man after man, his expression unreadable but radiating an intensity that none of them could hold. Finally, his eyes settled on Jedediah Crandall, who stood frozen, his lunge aborted, his face a comical mask of shock and thwarted rage. "The next one," Silas said, his voice now low and serrated, each word scraped raw and clean of any emotion but won't be for the sky. A shiver went through the crowd. This was not the weary, tolerant Sheriff Thorne they knew. This was someone else. Someone harder, more dangerous. "She stole because she's starving," Silas continued, his voice gaining strength, becoming a public declaration. He gestured with his chin towards Nita, who stood behind him, her eyes wide, watching him with a dawning, incredulous expression. "She's carrying a child. Look at her. Just look." He forced them to see her, not as a symbol of their fears, but as a person, a young, pregnant, terrified girl. Some in the crowd shuffled their feet, their gazes dropping. The women, in particular, looked away, a flicker of shame or sympathy in their eyes. The mob's righteous certainty was beginning to fracture, replaced by a grudging, uncomfortable humanity. "If that's a hanging offense in Clearwater Gulch," Silas declared, his voice ringing against the silent buildings, "then you'll have to hang me first. Because I will not stand by and watch it happen." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "As for your cow, Jedediah," he locked eyes with the stunned rancher. "I'll buy her. Right here, right now. Name your price." The offer was a masterstroke. It removed the entire premise of their rage. With the cow paid for, there was no theft. There was only their prejudice, laid bare for all to see. Crandall sputtered, completely outmaneuvered. He was a businessman, a man of property. The public offer, in front of the whole town, put him in an impossible position. To refuse was to admit it was never about the cow. To accept was to lose face, to be bought off by the very man defying him. He stammered, his eyes darting around for support that was no longer there. The crowd was silent, watching, waiting. The momentum had shifted entirely. "Your price, Jedediah," Silas repeated, his tone implacable. $30, Crandall finally choked out, naming an exorbitant price out of pure spite. Silas didn't even blink. Done. He holstered his pistol, the motion a final, definitive act. He reached into his coat, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and counted out the bills into Crandall's trembling hand. "She's my cow now." He had done it. He had faced down the mob, not with violence, but with moral clarity. He had sacrificed his money, his reputation for neutrality, and his quiet life. And in doing so, he had asserted something more valuable. That compassion was not a weakness, and justice was not the same as revenge. The energy of the mob was broken, dissipating into the cold night air like smoke. People began to drift away, murmuring amongst themselves, unwilling to meet the sheriff's eye. Silas turned his back on the remnants of the crowd and faced Nita. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a signal for her to move. He put a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of guidance, not force, and steered her towards the door of his office. He led her inside, along with the cow, which he tethered to the post out back. He closed the door, shutting out the town and its judgment. The silence inside the small office was profound. It was the silence of a storm that had passed, leaving behind a strange and fragile calm. Nita stood in the middle of the room, looking impossibly small, her shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that went bone deep. She watched him, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and a tiny, nascent flicker of something that might one day become trust. He didn't lock her in the holding cell. The thought never even crossed his mind. The cell was for criminals. He pointed to the simple cot that stood against the far wall, the one he used on long nights when he was too tired to go home. "You can rest here," he said softly. She didn't move, just watch him as he walked over to the small pot-belly stove. He stirred the embers and added a few pieces of kindling, his movements economical and calm. The room was cold. He was thinking of her, of the child. He put a pot of coffee on for himself. the familiar ritual a way of grounding himself after the adrenaline of the confrontation. Then he remembered something. He went to his supply cupboard and took down a small, precious tin of condensed milk he'd been saving. He walked over to her, holding it out. He didn't say a word. He just offered it. Nita looked from the can in his hand to his face. She saw no pity there, no condescension. She saw only a quiet statement of fact. He had paid for the cow. He had faced down the town. And now he was offering her the very thing she had risked her life for. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, he thought she might speak. Instead, her eyes welled up with tears she refused to shed. After a long, silent moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, she reached out and took the can. Her fingers were steady. She gave him a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a beginning. Silas turned away, giving her privacy. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the now empty street. The dust was settling. The lamps were going out. Clearwater Gulch was retreating into the darkness, its anger spent, its conscience pricked. He felt the immense weight of what he had just done settle onto his shoulders. He had made an enemy of the most powerful man in town and declared himself the protector of an outcast. His life would never be the same. Then he heard it, a faint, metallic scraping sound. The sound of the tin can being opened. It was a small, simple noise, but to Silas, it was the most profound sound in the world. It was the sound of survival, the sound of a life he had stood for, the sound of a promise kept. He didn't turn around. He just listened, the weight of his badge feeling both heavier and lighter than it ever had before. The night was cold, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, the silence in his office was filled not with loneliness, but with a quiet, resilient, and undeniable hope. The law had a body, but justice, he was learning, had a soul. And tonight, for a pregnant Apache girl and the cow she had stolen for milk, he had chosen to serve the latter. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts.